If more of you supported the show, I'd be less sick of podcasts.
Blah, blah, blah.
Sending out good vibes.
Blah, blah, blah.
Good vibes.
Blah,
Good vibes.
blah, blah.
Good vibes. Good vibes.
108 breaths of deep gratitude and prayers for guidance and protection. And put on a didgeridoo and shamanic drumming track. Shivers or vibrations and stuff like that.
Grimerica.
Okay, guys, welcome back to our America Show, coming at you with an extra episode. We're going to release this one next month, but since I accidentally released both of our episodes that were scheduled for the vacation last week, we decided we'd throw this one out as episode 611, and so you guys don't have an extra week off, so you can find another show and then leave us forever.
Yeah.
We got Grand Pussy Magnet Dunlop over here.
Yeah. Just petting my cat and, like the evil genius that I am. Yeah.
And
No, this was a good one too. This is a good one. It's an interesting chat about, the Oka Standoff, land claims, the Indian Act, and sort of awakening the government to this stuff. I think it's an important, I don't really know much about it compared to you and stuff. I remember it happening as a kid, but you seem to think that had a real sort of a turning point on the way the government and the Indians were dealing with things, right?
Well, they haven't really fulfilled the duty to consult since then, as near as I can tell. And they introduced the Firearms Act a couple years later.
Oh, interesting.
Without consulting the Indians, who might have had something to say about that, considering they had just had to defend their land with firearms.
Right. And there was a couple fatalities.
There was a couple fatalities, yeah. I mean, and that was in the 90s. If shit like this happens today, it's going to get out of control fast. I mean,
Right.
I think we're probably ripe for that right now. I mean, I don't know where the general pulse of the Canadian Indians are. So, I talked to a few. I know that a bunch are reading my stuff, but they don't reply. So I'm not actively in conversation with them, but I know when we talked to Bud, he seems to agree. Kyle seems to agree. So I do talk to some guys that agree. And it does seem like right now the federal government, at least, and the provincial governments as well, but the federal government at least seems to be extremely tepid around the Indian thing right now. I mean, I've been testing that personally with some laws. And I mean, I was out with my Indian buddy hunting on the weekend, and he's like, well, of course they're not going to fuck with you for your handgun, dude. They don't even fuck with the Indians when they block a railroad for a month or something like that, right? Because I think there's a real fear from the Canadian government that we might be, worse than the truckers.
Well, they've also got themselves in problems with the woke. There's an overlap here. There's a Venn diagram where there's an overlap in the middle where the woke and sort of like us, like sort of, independent media would kind of agree on some things, right? So the government's kind of stuck right now because they've got themselves tied up with all this wokeness, which means they can't really probably do what they want to do because it's going to look real bad.
And all that aside, they just won't be able to quell our insurrection if it happens. They won't be able to stop it. If you get 1 million Indians in Canada, is about 3% of the population. There's a lot less than the truckers that went to Canada. And I'm not saying that the support is there, but if I'm just talking in actual numbers,
yeah,
they're spread out coast to coast. They've got major infrastructure running through all of their land that that they can cripple quickly.
Yeah,
and it's going to be pretty hard if a couple 100,000 Indians show up in Ottawa. It's going to be pretty hard to call them Nazis.
Yeah,
it's going to be pretty hard to paint them as anything that puts public support against them. It's going to be pretty hard to pit, and it's a device of their own making. But if 500,000 Indians in Canada say enough is enough, they've got a problem on their hands.
And my sense is that, you know, how you mentioned about the temperature of you're not sure about it. My sense is it's divided like every other sort of group these days. It's probably polarized, like a lot of people
Well, it was unanimous against C21. Unanimous.
Against C21.
New handgun legislation, new firearms legislation is 100% being rejected by every chief in Canada.
That's interesting.
There might be some that don't feel like that personally, but and that we're not hearing about. But the Association of First Nations Chiefs has all got together and said, no. I mean, my personal thing is that I think Indians are close. I think we can negotiate an end to the Indian Act in my lifetime, and I think we can do something about just that. You know, I think that we are that sort of wild card that they don't know what to do with in Canada. We've seen what happened when the truckers tried to do it. They were able to take care of that with bank accounts. Like, I just don't think that they can close Indians' bank accounts without
a huge backlash
of Canada. You know, like they managed to quell the truckers. I don't even know how they did that, but like you said, that was probably closer to 50-50. You know, it's probably a pretty even divide, or at least close enough that it's hard to tell. Whereas, I don't know, man. Even if
that's where the
don't agree with the Indians, they're not going to say it.
But that's where the wokeness comes.
Pretend they're going that they do.
Yeah.
And then
exactly. That's where the wokeness gets in on our favor. Is they got to pretend that they agree with that. There's got to be some virtue signaling in there, which will stop them from doing what they would have done before.
If I said I wasn't trying to stoke that fire,
you did when.
Well, I mean, that's what my whole publication is about.
Right.
It's about getting all of the bands across Canada, at least getting information from one source. And I'm not saying that I should be the source, but at least I'm not fucking the state. And there doesn't seem to be anything else in Canada doing it. And if there is, I haven't seen it. And if they're the ones that are like the APTN network and stuff like that, that shit's all funded by the government, man. It's all funded by the government. So there's a bunch of shit they're not going to say. So I'm just going to keep.
Sorry, what network is that? The AP?
The Aboriginal People's Television Network, I think.
Right.
I don't. That's I don't know where you get it. I don't have cable or anything like that. But I mean, I just don't feel like there's any institutions in Canada that are not getting money from the government that are trying to run any sort of publications. If there is, I could be ignorant of them. But I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And I hand selected all the chiefs and council members' emails off the internet. It took fucking weeks.
Yeah.
To get them onto that mailing list. And it seems to have got a good reception. And dude, the amount of fucking chiefs or, you know, council members that I get replying to my emails that have never fucking heard of the information I'm sending them is astounding.
Wow. Whoa, what?
Yeah.
So let's just mention what you're talking about. You're talking about a CanadianShame.substack.com, which is also called Indigenous Opinions, right? So I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, that's the one. It's got, you know, it's all Indian stuff. So if you guys want to check it out, if you want to support all that stuff, be great. Speaking of sports, support the show. Grimerica.ca/support. We can't do this without you guys. We do our best to try and get all these interviews and stuff out. Hope we're adding some value to your life. Hopefully you can add some value to our life. Best way
I think Kyle Delisle was on this show too, right?
Yeah, our buddy Kyle Delisle, who's also a huge part of Indigenous Opinions. That's kind of a joint effort in some ways with him. He's been doing a lot of the creation stories and he's been sending me a lot of resources. So yeah, I would say he is a big part of that. And he's a big part of this interview. Support the show, Grimerica.ca/support. Head out, check out our other podcast, GrimericaOutlaw.ca. You got a bio for Bud?
No, I don't.
No bio. But I mean, we kind of get into all that in the show. There's kind of a weird intro because, like I said, we were going to start another podcast a while ago all about all this stuff, but it, you know, quickly just became it was going to be hard to get a lot of interviews. It's seemingly because even now through Indigenous Opinions, I'm having trouble getting anyone to be willing to come on and do a print interview with me. I don't know if it's a distrust of the media thing or if it's just that people feel like they don't know enough to come on and talk about it, which could be the case.
Oh, that's interesting. Like, yeah, it could be a bit of both. Yeah.
Emails from people that should know this shit that are running fucking bands in Canada and they don't, and it's kind of disheartening.
Well, there's a couple people we should have on. I've been somebody's got me a couple names of some people that are sort of pushing back against this UNDRIP thing as well, this UN declaration. We should probably have them on too.
Yeah, I'd be into all that. I tried to get the main chief in Canada on, and she just flat out said no. So, but I mean, I get it. People might not like my style, even if they do agree with my message. I'm probably a little over the top, but whatever. Fuck them if they can't take a joke.
Yeah.
Everyone that ends up pushing the ball over the hill has to be a little over the top, I think.
Yeah.
All right, you got anything else? We get out of here. I got to get out.
That's it. Let's do it. Yeah. Have a good trip.
All right, guys. Enjoy the chat with Bud Morris.
And Kyle.
And Kyle Delisle.
Welcome to the first episode of the Indian in the Room podcast, where myself, Darren Grimes, Kyle Delisle, and Graham, I probably butchered your last name, Kyle, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. It's
Delisle, are going to, we've decided, Kyle and I met each other, it wasn't too long ago now. We met each other just a few months ago. I mean, we've been interacting on the internet and stuff like that for a lot longer, but we finally met each other and got to hang out for a week there down in Washington a while ago, last May. And since then, we've been sort of back and forth and talking about this, the indigenous situation in Canada. We kind of both come from, we're both in status Indians, as we're called in Canada. And we come from very different backgrounds, where Kyle's spent his whole life, or most of it, on the reserve. I've been quite the opposite. I was raised off the reserve, away from the culture, and I'm just now getting back into it at 40. And so we're kind of coming at it from different angles. I know Kyle was part of the protest back in the 90s and the blockades and stuff like that, so it'll be interesting to hear all that come out, whereas I was sort of ignorant to all this. And I'm coming back at it at 40 so that I can teach it to my kids. And it's an important topic right now. We were sort of discussing how we were going to approach it, and we've decided the best way is to just go across Canada and talk to as many elders, survivors, knowledge keepers, professionals. I mean, whoever we can talk to get as much of this knowledge down and into a digital format before it gets too far gone. So we've got Bud today, who's going to join us. Before we get to him, well, Kyle, I suppose I'll let you say a few words. And of course, we've got Graham Dunlop, who's along for the ride as a complete outsider. He's my co-host on the Grimericans show. He's my business partner and all sorts of things, and he's compassionate to the cause, and he just wants to learn. So he's going to come along, and he can sort of offer that questions and insight from someone who's coming at it from the
Ignorance, maybe?
From the ignorance of the, I guess we could say, the typical settler who's just been raised in Canadian lore and propaganda and everything else, and where it's just sort of, it's all coming open to him at the same time, whereas a few of us kind of knew a lot of this has been going on for a while. So I'll hand it off to you for a minute there, Kyle, and then I'll let you introduce Bud, since you guys have a bit of a history together.
Yeah, okay. Like I said, my name's Kyle Delisle. So Mohawk Indian from the Ganawage Reserve, or as we like to call it, the Mohawk Territory of Ganawage, which is just south of Montreal. I was born and raised and lived in Ganawage for most of my life. The only time I didn't was when I served 6 years in the United States Marine Corps. Then once I got out of the Marines, I came back home and was pretty much here for the rest of the time. I happened to leave right during the 1990 protest, where I know we'll be talking with Bud. Bud was quite involved with that as well. And kind of like you, I even though I was on reserve for most of my life, I kind of got away from our traditional ways and the culture and the language. And only in the past 2 years, really, have I beginning to reconnect with it. And to the point now where I'm, researching the book right now to connect the Iroquois legends, or other people call us Iroquois, we call ourselves the Haudenosaunee. So those myths and stories that we have, and reconnecting them back to the stars, which we lost that knowledge. So I've been doing a lot of research into our myths and legends, and as well, reading a lot of Graham Hancock and watching Randall Carlson videos, which really got me into the the Younger Dryas boundary cataclysm, and researching our creation story and seeing how that accurately portrays what happened during that time. But other than that, for most of my life, for most of my professional life, I worked in economic development with Bud. Bud and I were both in the Kahnawake Economic Development Commission, or as we called it, Dawadunyazakta. Bud was the CEO for 17 years, I believe. Bud, correct? 17 years, and then he handed it off to me, and I became the CEO. I was CEO for a couple of years, and I've now left the organization. But yeah, Bud and I had worked side by side for almost 20 years together. So, and that's why, as one of the first guests, I know you and I, Darren, we've been talking a lot. Our initial conversation started around the Indian Act, and Bud is probably one of the people I know best that knows the Indian Act inside and out a lot better than I do. I don't think I've actually ever read it, maybe just parts of it. So I'll hand it off to Bud if you want to introduce yourself and talk about your grand experience that you've had.
Thank you, Kyle. Pleasure to be here. Darren Graham. My name is Bud Morris. Mohawk from Kahnawake. Been here most of my life. I've had a variety of professions, I guess. I used to be an iron worker at one time. I studied to be a teacher at McGill University, but dropped out to pursue a career in politics, and I was an elected chief for 2 terms, 4 years with the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake. I was an executive director for the Mohawks of Kahnawake for 7 years after my term of being a chief was ended. And then I went on to be the executive director for the Lower Nicola Indian Band out in British Columbia, in Central Interior. I left there, went to work for the federal government as Director General for the Aboriginal Relations Office in the Human Resource Development section of the Government of Canada. And then I was recruited to come back to Kahnawake to head up the Kahnawake Economic Development Commission, where I'm still employed. I'm no longer, as Kyle said, the Chief Executive Officer. I'm the Chief Operations Officer now. But I've had a fairly extensive experience dealing with a variety of topical issues surrounding Aboriginal people, Aboriginal rights. It goes way back before my political career. I was, I guess you could say, a local activist in our community, trying to assert protect our rights here in Kahnawake. And so I'm very familiar with certain aspects of the Indian Act. Probably one of the few people that I know who's been charged with illegal possession of alcohol. I had a case of 12 beers in my house. And that beer was seized, and I was charged with illegal possession of alcohol under the Indian Act, and I had to pay a fine. So there's a lot of interesting aspects to the Act and how it impacts our lives as single-only people, as Aboriginal people, and certainly I would enjoy an opportunity to discuss some of those with you.
What year was that when you were charged with illegal possession of alcohol?
I think it was 1976.
So was that not amended until 85? That part?
No, it was subsequent to that. Alcohol was prohibited up until I think 1993.
So
And
is that
then-
sorry? Would that have been prohibited to all Indians or just on reserves at that point?
No, a general prohibition.
It was
also
still.
refused access to various bars. A lot of people were off reserve. You try to go in a bar. If they didn't like you, they'd say, "Oh, you can't let you in. You can't serve you. It's illegal. You're Indian." That was just the way things used to roll back then. So we used to find places where Indians were welcome, and we were served alcohol. In 1995, I think we had a 2-year gap where we had an opportunity of either passing legislation locally to prohibit the sale of alcohol and replacement of the Indian Act, or in absence of such local legislation, the provincial regulations would apply, meaning that it would be a provincial jurisdiction on reserve regarding the sale of alcohol. So they eliminated that part of the act that says that it's illegal to sell alcohol. They left it to each community to decide whether they wanted to continue the prohibition, or if you chose to accept alcohol, then you had to accept provincial jurisdiction. Genocide did a different thing. It exercised what it considered its Aboriginal right to regulate the sale of alcohol and keep the province out of the territory. But it's not necessarily a legal instrument that they use. It hasn't been tested yet. But, you'd have to go all the way back to Section 35(1) of the Constitution Act of Canada, which says that Aboriginal rights and treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. Well, Aboriginal right is not defined. It's subject. It's an empty box, and slowly but surely, since the repatriation of the Constitution in 1982, it's been the Supreme Court of Canada, followed by certain legislation from the Government of Canada, that's filling in the empty box, as well as self-government negotiations and agreements. Genocide would rely on the fact that, pre-European contact, which is the test for Aboriginal rights, certainly we didn't have alcohol on the reserve, so we didn't regulate it, so we can't claim an Aboriginal right to regulate alcohol pre-contact. But we can say that we had a regulated society, that we had local governments that were in charge of all manner of things, and they regulated certain things. And that is where our rights to regulate the sale of alcohol is sent from, an Aboriginal right to govern ourselves, to self-government.
Are those the two sort of biggest are those the two biggest problems left from the act today, are the self-governance, which sort of takes in a lot, right? That could go everywhere from alcohol to child services to, and all the way down the line to who decides, who's a member of the band, who decides whose status, who's not. And the other one I think is probably land. Would you agree with that? Or do you think there's some other hidden ones in there still that are still major factors?
Well, I mean, there's the legal framework, and then there's the philosophy of the government. Well, let's take a short walk back. Kyle's going to laugh because he knows I like telling long stories. The Prime Minister of the day, John Delisle, in 1887, said the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. And that's been the attitude of the government for over 100 years. And in fact, it really only been in the last 5 years, I would say, that there's been a change in the government's viewpoint. And Trudeau famously said that we want to establish nation-to-nation relationships with Aboriginal people. Of course, that hasn't happened, but it's a signal. It's a step forward. I mean, we're over 20 years past, 25 years past the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which had hundreds of recommendations on what the government can do, what people can do to equalize society so that Aboriginal people are full beneficiaries. And that's really the end story, is that there's a huge inequity in Canada in the wealth distribution, or the distribution of Canada's wealth. Most of it is still owned by Aboriginal people. Hasn't been ceded, hasn't been treated, hasn't been given up, wasn't conquered, but has been taken. Either through the dominant society aspect or through its legal instruments like eminent domain. But those lands and the resources still belong to the Aboriginal people. And that's what they're fighting for, as well as the rights to govern themselves. So it's a long and complicated history. I mean, there's certainly subsets of all kinds of things that can draw some insights on the 60s scoop, which was the result of Canada saying, all right, child welfare is no longer the responsibility of Canada, and explicitly said it's the responsibility of the provinces. And that was the provinces saying, okay, we're going to go and check, make sure all the Indians are being properly taken care of. If we don't think they are, we're going to take them out of the house and we're going to put them somewhere else. It wasn't much different from the residential school system, where pretty much the same thing happened. Kids were torn from their families and, without the consent of the parents in many cases. So the legacy is, as I said, it's legislative in one sense. The Indian Act is an archaic piece of legislation, and it certainly has its history rooted in an assimilationist viewpoint or philosophy. Today, I don't think there's any real thoughts that the assimilation approach is going to work. The 1969 white paper that then Prime Minister Trudeau was supporting and written, or at least introduced, by Jean Chrétien, who was the Minister of Indian Affairs back in 1969, and subsequently, of course, became Prime Minister of Canada. That was dismissed out of hand as being totally unacceptable for Aboriginal people. We wanted our own identity, we wanted to practice our own rights and culture, and we wanted our share of the wealth. And we still do. Nothing has changed in that regard. And it's taken Canada well over 100 years to wake up and acknowledge that the assimilationist approach policy has failed. It has not worked, and it will not work. So they have to try something different. And they have to find some way of creating equity. That's the challenge.
I'm not quite sure how to frame it, but how can that sort of, or how is it, what do you think is causing the change in the last, because I agree it is only 5 years. I mean, you have the Truth and Reconciliation Report in 2015, you have Harper's we've gotten the apologies over the last 2 decades, but we haven't really seen any real change. I would almost argue until this month is the first. Now you've been involved in it a lot longer than I've been paying attention, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. But I definitely agree on no movement until like 2016, 2017. And then now it seems like this Cowess's nation in Saskatchewan now I haven't even looked in the particulars of it completely on if the dots are dotted and the T's are crossed on them getting their control of their child welfare back. But I mean, in my lifetime, that's sort of the first major thing I've seen towards, real reconciliation.
Well, the process has certainly been slow, and what has woken up the politicians and the public in general, I think, has been a slow but steady stream of revelations. And you can go back. We won't go that far back, but let's start with the issue of inequity or discrimination against Indian women. And made it to the Supreme Court on, I think, 2 occasions. McIver, who's actually from the Lower Nickel Indian man, she went to the Supreme Court and won. And there was another court case, maybe 2 acts early. I don't know if she made it to the Supreme Court, but she certainly was an activist in that regard, fighting for Aboriginal rights for Indian women who lost their status through marriage. And that, you go back and you look at what had happened. It was a pure Western European mindset in terms of how they related with Aboriginal people and created legislation around them. All the rights flowed through the men. The woman had no rights. Zero. So actually, the woman didn't get the right to run in band council elections until I don't know when. So there's been a very slow progression of events that have become public and one after the other. And then you fast forward to the Royal Commission, which was an outcome actually from the 1990 Oka crisis. 1990 was a revelation for a lot of non-Native people and the government in particular, when they finally realized that they couldn't subjugate by force Aboriginal people. And they started to realize that if they didn't change the way they did business, Aboriginal people could cripple Canada. And they threatened to do that. One of my old friends, former chief in Ganawage, I served with him, Billy Two Rivers, said, we only have to take 1 foot out of every railroad in the country and cripple their economy. And of course, that actually was done in certain cases. During 1990, there was blockades everywhere. And it wasn't just in Ganawage. There was blockades out in DC. There was blockades out in Ontario. Those things were starting to, I think, wake people up. Start to understand that, we have an issue here. Kind of, if you look at the parallel, and I'm not certainly equating this, I don't want to get in any trouble and say that our situation as Aboriginal people is the same as the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, but there's some parallels there that can be drawn. And it's been a long process for the Black people in the United States to get, equity and equality, and they're still not there, and we're not there. Past that, you get to the more recent developments with the graves, not bodies, but they don't want to dig them up, but the announcements of hundreds, and there's probably thousands of unmarked graves of Indigenous people across Canada and the United States too. There's certainly they had residential schools as well. My uncle, granduncle, went to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And then you have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was an eye-opener for a lot of people. Everybody was trying to bury that issue under the rug. Indigenous women had been getting murdered and had gone missing for a long, long time. This is not new. We've known it, but nobody paid attention to it. And all of a sudden, it's reality, and people are saying they're shocked. How could this happen? How could we allow Indians to be treated like that? And the fact is, they're still being treated like that. So I don't want to use, the terminology that popular today, a woke culture. I think it's stronger than that. I think people are actually saying there's an injustice here. This is Canada, and we got to fix this injustice. And on the world stage, that's certainly true. Canada has a hard time criticizing China for breaches of human rights when its history is very, very clouded with abuses as well. There was a cartoon in one of the Chinese papers last week that showed Trudeau sitting on a pile of skulls. I mean, it's satirical, but the reality is that that's Canada's history. And they've been ashamed of it, and they try to hide it for a long time. And now the truth is coming.
But you touched on the 1990 blockade. Maybe you can just go into a bit of detail what exactly that was for people, some of our listeners who may not be familiar with it.
In 1990, there was a golf course development plan in our sister community of Genocide, which is about 35, 40 miles from here, from where I live, across the river. And it was on a pine forest, and pine trees are very symbolic in our culture, the symbol of peace. It's where all the weapons of war amongst our warring nations prior to our confederation buried their weapons under the great tree of peace and the white pine. On top of the white pines, it's an eagle who will warn of danger. So in this forest of white pines, there was a developer planning on putting an additional 9-hole golf course to add to the existing 9-hole golf course. And he had the support of the neighboring municipality, Oka. And the defenders of the land decided that was not acceptable. There was burial ground there as well. And, they said this is just not going to happen. So the developer got an injunction to stop the blockade as they were physically being prevented from doing any work there. And the Indians over here just said, no, we're not moving. We're not going to listen to your injunction. We're not going to honor it. So the police were called in on force, heavily armed, and tried to dismantle the blockade, or that was their intent. And there were shots fired on both sides. Nobody knows who fired the first one. And nobody knows who killed Corporal O'May, who was a provincial police officer with Quebec. He was struck by a bullet. Nobody knows who shot him. But they, of course, blame the Mohawks. And that sparked a huge confrontation. Ultimately, after so many days, I forget how many days before the army was called in to deal with the Mohawks. The governor of Quebec, Bourassa at the time, the premier, he requested the aid to the civil power from Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Mulroney agreed and sent to Quebec under the civil jurisdiction of Quebec, Canadian Army, with about 4,000 soldiers, which was actually more than they had in the subsequent war in Iraq. Canada had more presence here. And they had some vehicles with 76 millimeter cannons, machine guns. They had a Navy ship. I think it was an intelligence ship. Well, I didn't see any guns on it, but it was a big issue. An 87-day standoff. Mercy Bridge was closed. And the Mercy Bridge is one of the major links between the South Shore and metropolitan Montreal. One of 4 major bridges. So it was causing a huge inconvenience. A lot of people were non-natives were complaining, and they wanted the bridge open, and they were trying to force the issue. Eventually, the Canadian Army flew in Canadian soldiers by helicopter, Chinook helicopters, which are basically troop carriers, and they landed in Ganawagi on an island. It's not inhabited. And their plan was to search the island for weapons. That was their excuse, that they heard there was weapons, or they had intelligence that weapons were buried there, which was not true. And they planned to march through Ganawagi to demonstrate that they had asserted jurisdiction and authority. They got it wrong. They were met by hundreds and hundreds of Mohawk people, men, women, younger people, older people, and they fought hand to hand. I witnessed the whole thing. I was right there. I saw one guy grab a soldier's rifle and punch him in the face. Shots were fired, but by the army, but they're not at anybody. I think warning shots. Tear gas was fired. That's nasty stuff, tear gas. And the problem was that. It was quite a scene. And Alanis Obumswin, I think, made a film. She had a certain. Actually, I was helping her. She was trying to get away from the tear gas, and she had a bunch of equipment. Anyway. The end of the story is that Canada realized that, and Quebec, that we were very, very serious about defending our rights and our land, and that we weren't going to back down, even in the face of the army. We didn't care. We were going to defend them. And if it came to, fighting hand to hand, we were going to fight hand to hand. If it came to firing guns, we would fire guns. And that was a real awakening for the government. Subsequent to that, interestingly, the army had developed plans to invade Ganawagi by air, by rail, and by water, and by land too. Anyway, and they got leaked, the plans, and they denied it, of course. But it came from the Department of National Defense, so I think it's probably true. So they were, very unhappy that they were unable to subjugate the Mohawks of Ganawagi and Ganasodage with the Canadian Army, and they figured they needed to send a message to all the Aboriginal people in Canada that this is not going to be tolerated. We're going to put Canadian control, Quebec control over the Mohawks, and we're not going to have any civil disobedience ever again. That, of course, is not how it ended up. Ganawagi is pretty much a self-governing community. If the people haven't been here, even though it doesn't have the recognition from a legislative perspective of what it does by Canada or Quebec, there are certainly ongoing demonstrations of our jurisdiction. Gaming is one of them. We have our own gaming law. We regulate internet gaming as well as land-based gaming, contrary to what the criminal code says, contrary to what Quebec says we can do, and contrary to what Canada says we can do. But they haven't been able to stop us. And that's the reality. So I think the end message is that force does not work against us. So if force doesn't work, then we have to find another way, another route to harmonize our relationships. And that, this is a conflict of jurisdictions, which they've never acknowledged. From our perspective, that's what it is. It's a conflict of jurisdictions. We have ours, they have theirs. They're in conflict. They think they can use, their dominating power to subjugate us, and we've proven that's not going to happen. And there's societies all over the world that have proven the same thing. Take the Afghan people. They've been in war for hundreds of years. I think about 10 countries or more have tried to subjugate them and it hasn't worked yet. The United States just pulled out, or is pulling out now. So what is the route? And there has to be some dialogue, obviously. There has to be some acknowledgement that Aboriginal people have rights that have not been recognized by the government, and they need to be recognized, and they need to be done in a way that the two societies can coexist in peace. And for that to happen, we have to have equity. There has to be an equal distribution of Canada as well. Otherwise, it won't work.
I mean, that's interesting to think about. If you look at the historical timeline, that's like 12 months after Tiananmen Square. And I mean, how fucking close is that to just, I mean, you're really talking at that point, you're talking about the discipline of people with guns. You're sort of past the top down thing, is when you've got shots fired and you've got confrontation like that, it really only takes a couple of shots in the wrong direction before, you know, everyone's fired up and that whole thing ends a whole lot differently, which is sort of, I mean, you look at it that way, you know, there's just another sort of comparison between China and Canada there, where, you know, we're marching citizens on protesters too. We're marching the army on protesters here with guns and all that same stuff. But, you know, no one really talks about that because I guess because luckily our troops were disciplined enough, or their troops, however you want to label them. But luckily they were, to their credit, which is tough to give in this situation, but it seems like a sort of end to the Mohawks as well, that situation didn't escalate into something a whole lot worse than it could have.
Oh, absolutely. It could have been bloodbath. I mean, behind the scenes, there was a lot of things going on. We were trying to get the Red Cross to come in on a provisional basis. In other words, if we had that bloodbath, we need to have an evacuation center, we need a triage and all that kind of stuff. So we called the Red Cross, and the Red Cross said, we need a 1 mile no fire zone before we'll agree to come in. And we looked at each other and we said, we can't guarantee that. So we couldn't get the Red Cross to agree in the event that it would have been a major bloodbath. We couldn't get food in. I mean, we had to smuggle food in. And Canada denies this, of course, but they were, and Quebec denies it, but they were, provincial police and the Canadian Army were part and parcel of that whole blockade to try and starve us all. I had a conversation with one of my friends who was actually a famous lawyer, and I think he's famous now, James O'Reilly. He's very supportive of Aboriginal rights. And he had an insight into Barassa's thinking. So I called him. I said, Jim, we need to get food in here. I said, it's getting pretty bad. Is there any way you could use your contacts to find out if they would let us bring food in? So he says, all right, let me make a couple calls and get back to you. So he calls me back about a couple hours later. And this is in July, late July. And he says, Bud, he goes, I think you better start planting. I said, Jim, it's too late to plant. We're never going to get a harvest in. He goes, well, you ain't going to get food in either. Well, of course we did. We smuggled it. We had a whole network of people supporting us, non-natives, very appreciative of their help. But it was still a huge challenge. We had a woman who was hemorrhaging. She was giving birth and she started to hemorrhage. and the ambulance was stopped at the blockade on their end, which was manned by Search de Quebec, the police, and we'll call them vigilantes, I guess, for lack of a better term. And they wouldn't let the ambulance through until they verified that we actually had a woman in the back hemorrhaging. My wife at the time was going into labor, and she thought she was going to give birth imminently. And my brother tried to take her across in his car, and he was turned away. It ended up being a false alarm. She didn't give birth then, but these were the types of things that were happening. Certainly, human rights abuses, clearly. So Canada's got some reconciling to do with its history when it starts to criticize other nations and their treatment of their minority people.
Yeah, I remember I was 17 at the time. I just graduated high school, and my mom came home from work. She was working the night shift. She's a nurse at the hospital here in Ganawage, and she woke me and my dad up and said, "Get out there to the front line. Something's going on." And my dad and I were at the survival school blockade, and we had the radio going, and that's when we heard the firing. It was happening live, so we were already there on the front line. And so I think I was there maybe 1 or 2 weeks before I had to get smuggled out in order to go to Marine Corps boot camp. At first, I wanted to stay, of course, but my mom was like, "No, you have to go get trained so you can help us next time this happens again." And it was a very traumatic event, crossing by boat the St. Lawrence River, ending up in Lachine, and there's a huge protest going on with police turning on their sirens, pointing their rifles at us. We're all unarmed. And then I ended up getting interrogated by 2 SQ officers as well, and asked me what kind of weapons they had, and I wouldn't say a word. So they got mad at me and threatened to make sure that I would never go to Marine Corps boot camp. They wouldn't allow it, and then it was like, you have no say over that, so whatever. But I remember this all boot camp constantly receiving letters from my parents, saying how the situation was, where they were out of food. They've been eating the same pizza now for like 3 or 4 days. Really just on rations. To go to then, my dad was at the island too. I believe he got tear gas as well, and he ended up getting tear gas second time when there's a big fight. Remember by Glen Delrone's with the lights there. There was another confrontation there, and they got tear gassed again. It's like wherever my dad went, he got tear gassed. So it was fun times.
Yeah, it's certainly an experience that many of us remember quite well and distinctly. You kind of don't forget when you have a 50 caliber machine gun pointed right at you. I told Kyle that story before. But they pointed at us first. Was bringing in a group of Oneida chiefs who were trying to mediate in Ganasadaga to bring an end to the crisis. And we called the army and told them we were bringing in Oneida chiefs to mediate. And we didn't get clearance to go, but the chiefs were going anyway. So we got stopped at a checkpoint, which was manned by 2 SQ officers and 2 Army personnel. The Army personnel were in an APC, and I had a 50 caliber machine gun. And when we showed up, they swung that machine gun right at us. After about an hour or half hour of discussion between the SQ, and they had reinforcements brought in right away, I couldn't understand what they were saying. I couldn't hear them very well. But it was clearly a disagreement between the Army and the SQ. And slowly, that machine gunner turned his machine gun away from us and towards the SQ. I remember that one. Then the rest of them left. So they left only 2 there.
What do you think? Because you've been there for sort of 40 years plus or ish. Looking at this, I mean, 30 years already, 31 years this summer since that incident. What do you think? Let's start with what do you think the biggest thing? What do you think? Okay, let's do 3 of them. We'll start with what do you think the most culturally destructive single, if you had to pick one part of the Indian Act that was most destructive to culture, what would you pick?
There's so many. It's hard to pick. I mean, you could look at trying to destroy the matrilineal society in various communities, ours being one. That had a big effect. So let me explain that a little bit. So basically what you had was Indian women who were marrying non-native lost their status. And then you had Indian men marrying non-native women, and those non-native women gained status. So the Indian woman had to leave the reserve, and then non-Indian women came to the reserve. And that changed the whole culture, the whole dynamic that was going on. It was, I'm not saying those non-Indian women were bad people at all, but they weren't familiar with our ways and how we do things and their roles and our roles. There's a distribution of roles in our society. And it really disrupted for us. Had a disrupting factor, influence on where we're at today. So that's certainly a big one. In other places, it may be, I think it's different. The loss of their economics certainly would be a huge one. So you're living off the land, you got no welfare, you have no need for social society to support you because the community is living self-sufficiently. If somebody's not able to produce food, their health, everything, everybody works together. And that whole notion of collectivism was being replaced by force through economic subjugation. So you can't leave the reserve without a permit. That was one. You can't sell your goods unless you have a permit. And if the Indian agent doesn't like you, he ain't going to give you a permit. Well, here you are. One day, your community is totally self-sufficient, and then the next day, you can't support yourself, and you'll have a whole set of consequences after that, where Indian people become marginalized in society, in the economic well-being. They're not well economically. And then the land issue, of course, is part and parcel of that. So you end up, as my friend used to say, putting us on postage stamp reserves, little pieces of land that we can't support ourselves on anymore. We went from being able to hunt, fish, go for food, and now we don't have any of those rights, and we don't have enough land to do it. And you can't leave the reserve, by the way. If you do leave the reserve, we're going to think about enfranchising you so you can become a Canadian. I'm simplifying the whole sequence of events, obviously, but I think those would be probably the economic one, probably a big one for most Aboriginal people across Canada. And for Kahnawake, not as much, but certainly I think it was still a consideration. We've been a little bit more atypical, I would say. The government tried to encourage, well, didn't try, it did encourage an agricultural community. And there's not enough good land here. They gave us, they left us swamp. And there's not enough good agricultural land to support the whole community. So our people went find work elsewhere. Most of them went to the United States, did iron work. They found good paying jobs. They didn't ask for a permit. They just went. And they brought back cash. And that's how our community survived for the better part of almost 100 years. Until we were able to develop other economic opportunities.
So they destroyed your economy, and then one of the solutions you talked about was bringing back or having equity of Canada's wealth. It would be like one of the ultimate solutions. What does that look like? Like what do you mean by Canada's wealth in that regard?
Well, there's different ways of looking at it. My perspective is that the resources that Canada has gotten rich on are ours, for the most part. And there needs to be a discussion about how those resources should benefit not only non-natives, but also the owners of those resources. New Zealand has, I think, an example where they had a distribution of resources to the Maori based on GDP. I think Australia had a similar situation. Well, maybe I'm getting them mixed up.
Maybe Alaska too?
Yeah.
I think Alaska has some sort of situation with resources, specifically money from oil, gold, natural gas. A certain percentage of it goes to the historic tribes.
Yeah. From my perspective, the simplest way to recognize that land has not been ceded, and we need to find a way of compensating us for that lost land. What does that look like? Well, let's sit down and talk about it. We've got to have the discussion.
It seems like they've, you mentioned that they sort of swept it under or you mentioned something like that. And I feel like they've just been sweeping it under the rug for so long now. And I feel like they got tied up with the definition of, not on purpose, but it could be just a distraction of genocide. They talked about, this definition of genocide or this definition of genocide. And it seems like that's just been glossed over a lot, and maybe that's sort of held up resolution. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was an advocate of that term being used to describe the historical actions and, to a certain extent, current actions that Canada and the provinces were taking against Aboriginal people. And I met a few academics who disagreed with that. Some didn't, but most of them disagreed. Today, I think the conversation has evolved. Cultural genocide is being recognized as genocide. So and there's a definition through the UN that describes that. So when you take away their culture, basically you're killing the society. You may leave a life there, but you've taken everything else away, and that's genocide, at least as far as the United Nations is concerned. So I think that was really the intent. To me, it's clear as day. I read you the quote from John MacDonald: "Just get rid of the Indian." The residential schools was, they're trying to beat the Indian out of everybody. And the Americans, kill the Indian, save the man. That was the American model. But Canada has a hard time, and I understand that. You know, they prided themselves on being, you know, a very peaceful, prosperous country that very much favors equality of rights for everybody, a very tolerant society. But the history is not written that way from our perspective as it relates to Aboriginal people. You're right; they have swept a lot of it on the run. Now, the thinking, and I support this, is that history has to be revisited, and it has to be rewritten with a broader viewpoint that incorporates Aboriginal people, their viewpoints, their experiences. I mean, this is just a small example, but it's still going on today in various ways. So when I went to school, my history book said that when the French fought a war against the Indians, it was a victory. And when the Indians won, it was a massacre. And actually, in the history book, we weren't referred to as Indians, we were referred to as les sauvages, the savages. So that wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm not that old. And the history books have not really been updated properly. And there's been a good debate about that across the country, about the need to do that. But the problem is that, you know, you got a multiple set of jurisdictions here. The provinces, of course, have responsibility for education off reserve. And then you have school boards in Quebec. You have school boards elsewhere as well. Who's in charge of the curriculum? In Quebec, it's the government that's in charge of curriculum. So, you know, these things take time. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have multiple stakeholders that want to say it this way, they want to say it that way. And, you know, can we all agree on one set of facts? Probably not. But maybe we can agree to disagree. We can present multiple viewpoints. But again, the dialogue has to start. The recognition of the history, how it's been presented, what happened, has to be acknowledged by the governments, by society in general, so that we can move forward. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this quagmire of conflict for another 100 years.
Is there a movement at all, or a sentiment that you'd like to get back to, where, like you mentioned, the collectivism aspect, or like a self-sufficient community? You know, is there a sentiment to get back to that at some point, or without the government? I mean, the government's kind of it's messing up left, right, and center, and not just about this issue. I mean, they're overreaching everywhere. So is there like you mentioned the land part, and I understand what you mean about the equity of Canada's wealth and the resources and all that, but is there also a sentiment to getting land back, like to actually making the land the way it should be?
Well, certainly there has to be some land returned.
Yeah,
that's absolutely necessary in order for Aboriginal people to feel whole again.
Yeah.
We're under no illusions that we're going to be made completely whole. I mean, nobody's expecting whole towns and cities to get up and move.
Well, I want to just interject quick with the quick stat from this year on Canadian land ownership. As of 2021 January, 89% of all the land in Canada is owned by the government, either provincial or federal. Another 7% of that is owned by mega corporations. So you're down to 4%, 4% to 5% of all the land in Canada, less than 5%, is owned by private citizens. So that's one thing I want to make abundantly clear, is that we're not coming for your land. when we say we want our land back, it's not the farmer down the road. It's not there's plenty of land in Canada that is owned by the government right now to make things work. It's not, you're not taking your neighbor's house. We're not, that doesn't have to look like that, because I see some people get their back up about that. So I just wanted to interject that almost 90% of the land in Canada is currently owned by the government in some way, shape, or form.
And that's where the reservations are, right?
All the reservations are currently owned
in
by
the 90%. Right?
They're owned by the federal government. Yes.
Yeah. So how do we do that? Again, there's been acknowledgement that land has not been properly ceded, been taken without our consent. They have to acknowledge that and find it. Now they're going to say, yeah, we have the Aboriginal, the comprehensive land claims process. Oh, give me a break. That is so laboriously slow and inefficient and non-productive that you'd be hard pressed to find any support for that process amongst any sizable group of Aboriginal people. It's just a whitewash. It's just like, here. There's a process here. If you got grievances, take your land grievances there. And 25, 30 years later, maybe you'll get a settlement. But don't forget, the money that we forward to you to fight the land grievance is going to be deducted from your settlement. So you might end up with nothing. That's part, that's been the approach. Canada has been very cagey on trying to keep the resources away from Aboriginal people. And that has to stop. That dynamic, that attitude, that philosophy, the legislation surrounding it has to change.
Well, but they did give us National Aboriginal Day.
Everyone else gets a month.
In Quebec,
yeah, we got a day.
They don't want to make that a statutory holiday in Quebec.
Well, I think it's all, I really feel like we've got enough momentum this time to hopefully make a difference with it. We are the fastest growing demographic in Canada right now is status Indians, which is refreshing, because when you look at the residential schools, which is a terrible thing, and people think that ends, but it doesn't. They sort of mandatory attendance ends in the 60s, and then you have the 60s scoop where, admittedly, by the government, at least 20,000 Aboriginal kids are scooped up and sent all over North America. And some people are putting that number up at over 100,000. And then you've got that continuing. So I just want to quickly touch on the numbers. As of 2016, although Aboriginal children accounted for only 7.7% of all children aged 0 to 4, they account for over one half of all children in foster care in that age group. So we've still got this situation going on where Indian kids are being removed from their cultures, their families, their communities, and being, I think they're trying to pay a little more attention to that these days on making sure they're put in culturally acceptable homes. But I'm in the middle of doing a book on this kind of stuff right now, so I'm kind of digging through a bunch of it. And I was looking at pictures today from the 60s in I forget the name of the paper, the Star Phoenix was one of them, and the Regina something or other was another one, where they've got these little Indigenous kids, and it's like an advertisement to buy a pet, where it's like, Lucy, she's a chubby 3-year-old or 3-week-old, and she's a happy baby, and she can be yours if you just contact the number. And it's just one after another, after another, after another. And supposedly these articles are published all over North America at those times, because you hear the stories from the survivors who were sent to Louisiana, to Texas, I was reading one story from a fellow who was sent down to Texas someplace, and for most of his life he thought he was a Mexican. And it's just sort of disgusting. So before we wrap it up, I guess I'll ask either of my co-hosts if they have any more questions.
I don't think I have any right now off the top of my head, but I think we will most likely need to have Bud back again on a future episode. We barely touched on the Indian Act, so. I don't know about Graham, if you have any other
directions.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to touch next time on. It's hard to formulate as a question, but it would be about the PC culture nowadays, and if it's beneficial or damaging to the movement. And I don't know if that's something we want to address now, but like you mentioned, the woke part. And I know it's done some good, but I also feel like it's sometimes it's backfiring as well, because it gets if it swings too far over, and then people get a little bit disillusioned by it, and they stop believing or paying attention to it.
Yeah, well, I think on some of the activities that are going on, like say ripping down the statues or renaming buildings or schools or what have you. Or even the fact that, people, when they're having some type of major event, they have to acknowledge which tribal lands that they're currently on. None of those, in my opinion at least, I don't think any of those activities really impact Indians who actually live on reserve. Like I said, we still don't have clean drinking water. We still have the inequality. So we have all these other issues that aren't being addressed, isn't being addressed by tearing down a statue. Or renaming a school. That's
kind of what I'm getting at, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Bud's opinion on that.
Well, there's certainly a lot of emotional distress that people, have to release. And they're frustrated, and that, the burning of churches, which I do not support, even the tearing down the statues, I do not support. I mean, they can be educational. There just needs to be another lens added to that.
Or another statue beside it. Like that's what I kind of been thinking about that lately, is like you can't ban speech. So instead you beat bad speech with better speech. So instead of taking down statues, we just need to build another statue maybe beside it, or add a plaque to it, add a caveat. So when you come look at the statue, instead of learning nothing, you learn something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they should. Yeah, John McDonald's quote plaque beside, is the one in Kingston. I think that would be helpful. And then, provide proper resources for people. Residential schools, there should be I know there's a museum in BC, but there should be a national museum about residential schools and telling that story. The education of people, I think that's the benefit, I think, of the political correctness or the woke culture, is that it presents an opportunity to get certain things done that provide an education for the rest of society going forward, so that we don't have to go back and readdress this. We don't step backwards, we go forward. And that's, I think, helpful. And it creates the dialogue from there. We have to have, and I'm a strong believer in the dialogue, but we need two parties to have a dialogue. We've been talking to ourselves for a long
time. I guess I don't think you have anything. Do you have anything to promote? A website, anything like that our listeners should check out?
No, I'm just an ordinary guy.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the show. Do you have any closing thoughts? I mean, we're definitely, if you'll have us, we'd love to do this again. This is our first episode, and we plan to do hopefully hundreds of these eventually over the years. So hopefully we can have you on again, maybe in a few months, and you can see how far we've come, if we've come.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I'd love to come back and continue the discussion. And again, that's what it is. It's a discussion. So we can educate and inform people. I think we're making progress, and that's what the message, the last message I want to leave is: people should educate themselves about the real history of Canada and how we can right some wrongs. Let's not sweep it on the rug. Let's not ignore it. Let's address it.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on the show, Bob. We appreciate that. Before we wrap up, I guess we should ask our token white guy his takeaways from the episode. Maybe we could make that like a closing segment. What if Graham learned today?
Don't put me on the spot anymore. No, it's been eye opening again, and it was great to hear Bud's thoughts on the Indian Act and what's really happening. I mean, it happened so close to home. Like I grew up in the 80s, and it wasn't long. It was when I was a kid. This was still happening. That alcohol, that kind of stuff. So it's like peeling layers of the onion away. I've heard about residential schools for a long time, but just knowing now how bad they really were, and it's just sort of opening up layer upon layer of awareness on this, and it's just worse than I thought. I was sort of in the bubble, like most people, just not hearing it in the media and then not believing what the media says half the time. In my case. So just realizing that this is just way worse than I would have known a few years ago. Way worse than I realized. And it just, I hope that there can be proper conciliation. I like the way an author that I read his book recently calls it conciliation, because reconciliation signifies going back to the way it was, which was never a thing. Oh.
There's no hope in the past, only in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's a good wrap. Thanks for coming on the show, Bud. We hope to do this again down the road sometime, and we hope you guys enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Bud.
Bye.